Hi, I'm very happy to be here with you today to um, talk about COVID-19 in Africa. And the way I'm going to do this is basically to express certain misgivings that I have about the way that the pandemic is being addressed in Africa, but also share with you some useful concepts that are deployed in the sociology of knowledge to address disasters. Because the pandemic is really part of what we would describe as a disaster. That is, anything that has the potential to disrupt normal life is understood within the context of disaster sociology as a disaster, and that is why the pandemic is so interesting um, to to me. So what I will do, I will basically discuss three issues that I think are important. One is a very general issue, and it bears on concepts. So basically, the kinds of concepts that we use in the sociology of disasters. And then I will try to apply those concepts to the corona pandemic, just to show you how you can usefully work with those concepts. And then we look at how African countries, but in a very general way, how African countries are facing the pandemic. And I will be making a strong statement, which we can discuss when we meet. And I will basically conclude by expressing my doubts concerning how most African countries are facing the pandemic. Now, the field which is covered by the sociology of disasters is quite vast. Um, you can think of it in terms of a semantic field, which would include such concepts as risk, catastrophe, danger, hazard, crisis, stress, vulnerability, emergency, and many more. Each one of these concepts has a precise meaning depending on the theoretical approach that you adopt, and also depending on the kind of discipline that you come from. Usually disasters are an interesting subject, not only for sociologists, but also and mainly for human geographers, social geographers, and so on. So it's quite an interesting field, and most of the people working in this field would be juggling, as it were, these concepts that you see here. I want to draw your attention to one particular concept here, which is the concept of catastrophe. And this is really key. It's central to what disaster sociology does, because catastrophe, from its etymology, suggests the idea of a turning point, right? And this is actually the kind of understanding that is entertained in the sociology of disaster. This idea that we are dealing with things which disrupt social life. And they disrupt social life in a way that can change it in a radical manner, right? So catastrophe is a very, very important conceptual way of making sense of the object of disaster sociology. And in some languages, actually, uh, this is how disaster would be translated. So people would not be talking about disaster as this natural occurrence or man-made, but they would be talking about catastrophe. So they would describe what we're doing here as a sociology of catastrophes. Now, the three concepts that I want to share with you are basically the concepts of hazard or danger, risk, and vulnerability. And the idea is very simple here, and I don't want to make this in a very don't want to do it in a very complicated way. So basically, what we do is that we make a distinction between hazard and risk. We say that a hazard is like an external threat to our livelihood that we are not aware of, or for which we do not have coping mechanisms, that is to deal with it, and therefore, this is something that has a lot to do with lack of knowledge, um, because you can only address something if you know it, right? So that's what a hazard is, basically an external threat to livelihood. Now, a risk is different from a hazard because it assumes, or at least the assumption is made, that you are aware of an external threat to your livelihood, and you take the conscious decision to face it, right? So that's what is happening. For example, in the Netherlands, we know the sea level, that story, and we know that Dutch society has taken the decision to settle there, to build its houses there, and so on. Uh, that's, if you like, a risk attitude. It's a calculated risk that you are taking. Now, that presupposes the idea that you have the knowledge that is necessary to fend for yourself, to make sure that if disaster hits, that life will not stop, or that it will not completely collapse. And then also that you have the tools, the technology to address the the challenge, right? So there's an element of calculation in the idea of risk. And there's an interesting debate. I will not bother you with that debate, maybe in the discussion. But there's an interesting debate about, the different objects of the sociology of disaster and the sociology of risk. So some scholars, for example, the late German sociologist Ulrich Beck, who wrote the very famous book with the title Risk Society, but also people like Scott Lash and Anthony Giddens, who also wrote more or less along the same lines. These people claimed, for example, that the notion of risk was one that only made sense in technologically advanced societies, not in poor countries, right? And because there, if you don't have knowledge, you live in uncertainty, basically. And therefore you don't take risks, which is, of course, to a certain extent, nonsense, because there's no society that can exist without taking risks. I think the most crucial thing is not whether a society is able to take risks or not, but, well, basically, to what extent it can do that. And that is the subject of this image that you see here, basically to draw your attention to the notion of vulnerability, which basically seeks to describe the extent to which a society is vulnerable, that is likely to be particularly hit by an external danger. So you can understand, or you can make sense of vulnerability basically as a function of coping mechanisms available in a particular society. And I think this is the better way of really making sense of the distinction between hazard and risk. It's not about technologically advanced or non-technologically advanced. It's really about the vulnerability of a society. But what that also means is that if we want to understand how societies address particular challenges, then the best way to do that from a theoretical point of view is to uh, assume that societies are always in the process of translating hazards into risks, right? I think this is a very crucial point to make. It's quite central also to the sociology of disaster. So take the pandemic now. If you want to understand the pandemic from a sociological point of view, then you have to make the assumption that there is a process that societies are engaging in, which consists in identifying a hazard and then transforming it into a risk. So that's what I'm going to try and explain now in this section on the sociological nature of the pandemic. And I think there are three moments to take into account here: the moment of perception, the moment of translation, and then the moment afterwards, which I broadly describe as disaster risk management. So perception is, of course, in terms of what is dear to you, and what is dear to most societies is, of course, human life as well as the economy. So you see, you hear the news about this disease that's spreading rapidly in China, in Wuhan, and you think and that it's going to hit you soon, and therefore what you do is that you start thinking about how to protect lives, but also about how to protect the economy. So that's one moment. There's a hazard, it's coming your way, and you need to translate it into a risk. Now, how did most countries translate the corona pandemic into a risk? Well, they translated the pandemic into a risk by basically saying, okay, this thing is coming our way, and it's going to hit us, and it's going to be very bad. So what we need to do is to make sure that our health infrastructure is safe, right? So that it can be able to respond, because we have those means, right? And so we are going to we're going to create a set of measures in our society designed to flatten the curve of infection, right? So we will need to take measures that will help us contain the spread of the disease in order to protect our health infrastructure. So the idea here is not to save lives straight away. The idea is to say, okay, we are going to lose some lives. We will try to keep the number of lives that we are going to lose very low by adopting a whole set of measures. You went through that yourselves, social distancing or physical distancing, as some people would prefer to call it, and so on. I put the word normal in inverted commas to drive home the message that, of course, there is no such thing as a normal death rate under such circumstances. And then, so with the hazard perceived in this way as a threat to the health infrastructure, and then all the measures that you put in place to address it, then you can go about basically, drawing lessons from, the experience that you're going through. So those lessons will have to do with social preparedness, but also with the resilience of society. That is, the resilience of your health system, the resilience of your economy, the resilience of all sorts of institutions that you have to address external dangers. So this is, if you like, the way in which most countries in the world uh, translated the corona uh, uh, virus into a risk. So the idea here is not, to take weapons, like vaccines and drugs and so on, and kill the virus. That is not the thing. But it is to say, okay, so this is the nature of the danger that it poses to us, and this is what we can do to protect ourselves, right? So that's what happened. Now, what happened in Africa was basically that African countries uh, followed, if you like, the way that other countries, especially European countries, translated the hazard, the danger posed by the corona virus into uh, a risk. So a lot of African countries introduced lockdown measures, which were quite hard. I mean, they were very dramatic in South Africa, but they were also quite dramatic in countries like my own, in Mozambique, in Angola, in Senegal, and so on. So they copied this idea that corona poses a threat to the health infrastructure, and so you need to protect it. And they also copied the idea that when you will need to make sacrifices as far as the economy is concerned in order to protect lives. And so by adopting lockdown measures, basically they did that at a very, very high cost to their economy. So when they applied these things, so when they pasted what they copied, uh, what it then meant in practice was that uh, they basically destroyed their social infrastructure. That is the network, the web of social relationships that is so crucial for human survival in a lot of African countries, by preventing people from going about their lives outside because of the danger of infection. Um, so by preventing people from doing that, basically what they did was that they undermined the ability of people to survive, to fend for themselves. And actually, in a very cruel sort of way, they they gave people no reason to have a life to protect, which is quite contradictory, actually. And the worst thing about the whole process, of course, is that there is no end in sight. I mean, there is no health infrastructure to be protected in these countries. So the kinds of measures that were taken do not make sense at all. But at the same time, they cannot get out of the lockout or lockdown measures simply because they do not have the capacity to address the situation should it get worse. So in fact, what is happening in African countries now is that uh, in theory, they should wait until a vaccine is discovered to loosen, if you like, their lockdown measures, which doesn't make much sense. So that's really taking me to my conclusion to this. I think that we have a serious problem when we engage in the process of translating a hazard into a risk without taking into account our own circumstances, right? Then we have a problem because we are actually doing things that might even undermine us more than perhaps it would be the case if we did not copy and paste other people's solutions. In fact, as sad as it sounds, and as cruel as it sounds, the nature of the choices confronting African countries radically different. It's radically different from the choices confronting European countries. So really, if we accept what scientists claim about the potential and dramatic effects of COVID-19, then really the choice in Africa, in most African countries, perhaps with the exception of South Africa, is between having many deaths while protecting the economy, or having many deaths while not protecting the economy, and that's a dramatic situation that these countries face, and that is what I would really then love to discuss with you when we have the opportunity to to have a discussion on these very simple ideas that I put across to you. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that you will have a lot of questions and that I will be able to address them when the opportunity arises. So thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, everyone here, and welcome to our final Q&A session for our IDS COVID-19 mini lecture series. Thank you for joining as we conclude our discussions on the current pandemic. So today we're joined by Dr. Elisio Macamo, I hope I'm saying that correctly, a professor of sociology with a focus on Africa at the University of Basel. So we're very excited to have you here with us today to engage in another perspective on the pandemic. Just to briefly recap, Dr. Macamo's interesting lecture on copying and pasting our way into a disaster discusses how COVID-19 is being addressed in African countries from a sociological perspective. In his lecture, he presents the sociology concepts hazard, risk, and vulnerability to help understand the sociological nature of the pandemic. And he explains how several countries, including many European countries, perceived COVID-19 as a hazard or external threat to people's lives and the economy. And as a way to translate this hazard to a calculated risk, a set of measures were put into place to contain the spread and flatten the curve so as to not overwhelm the health infrastructure. He also explains that African countries followed this translation of hazard to risk through the enforcing of, in several cases, extreme lockdown measures. He argues that the copying of economic sacrifices to protect lives and to mitigate the threat to health infrastructure, which may actually look different than in other countries, came at a high economic cost. Additionally, he argues that the pasting of the lockdown measures was disruptive to the social infrastructure in African countries and ultimately undermined the people's abilities to defend themselves. So he also concludes by pointing out the danger of translating hazard into risk without really taking into account the circumstances in the African countries. And now it looks like we have Rose joining us here. She's coming. And I will turn it over now to Judith, who's prepared a few questions to start off the Q&A.
Yes, I had, first of all, it was a very, very interesting lecture. I very much enjoyed it. But then I think maybe I will let Edith ask maybe the first question or the first two questions, and then I will come in last.
Yeah, whatever works. Yeah, you feel like, okay. Thank you very much for giving the opportunity. Maybe I should briefly introduce myself. I'm Edith van Ewijk. I'm a postdoc researcher and a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam at the Governance and Inclusive Development Group. I was also involved in one of the other lecture series. And I also really liked your lecture. I really thought it was a really nice way of explaining the risks, the hazards, and how different countries deal with it. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I actually have two questions. And my first question is, well, of course, I was really fascinated by, well, fascinated, maybe not a good word, also shocked by the way how different countries are copying certain policies. But I also heard that, especially in West Africa, who has a region which experienced the Ebola and the spread of Ebola, also have their own experience and the knowledge. And I wondered to what extent that also played a role at taking certain measures, or do you feel it was really merely copying from policies from the global north? And the second question is a bit different, but my question is simply, what would you advise the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs to do? And that question is really concrete actually, because our professor Judith Gupta is actually invited to discuss policies with the minister in 2 weeks time, or I think 1 week time. So she really would like to have some input, and I wonder, because yeah, from your perspective, where should donor organization, donor governments specifically look at if you want to contribute in how countries in Africa could deal with the disease, and especially taking into consideration issue of inclusiveness and to reaching the most vulnerable people? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm I feel honored to have been asked to address your class, to have been given this opportunity, and your comments make me very happy, I have to say. And I think that this is actually a very interesting issue to address against the background of the major broader concern that we have with African studies, or that I have with African studies. So I'm not really primarily interested in COVID-19, but I'm really interested in, in this pandemic, to the extent that it helps us refine our way of looking at Africa, and also, work better with the concepts that we have. So that is why I chose to focus on some key concepts in the sociology of disasters, really to try out, to follow up on the implications that those concepts carry. So I'm very happy that the message was understood. The summary that Elisa gave, made me understand my own lecture even better, right? Now, so I will answer the questions Edith asked. These are very important. And I'll start by referring to a British anthropologist, Paul Richards. Maybe you have read his work. He's one of the most important experts scholars, researchers, especially on Sierra Leone, on local knowledge. He's really an authority on that. He's known to a lot of anthropologists. And he published a book recently, maybe a year or two ago, on the Ebola crisis in West Africa. And he really looked at the response there. And there's something fascinating he claims in that book. And that is, he says that if these countries had had a health infrastructure which they could have used to address the Ebola crisis, many more people would have died. That's amazing, because you see, when Ebola started, we had these horror scenarios like we have now with COVID. Or millions of people will be dying in Africa, and in fact, very, very few people died. In fact, fewer people died than those whose lives were lost because of COVID-19, right? Now he says that the reason why that did not happen in West Africa was that people relied on community infrastructure. And community infrastructure is basically the strength of social ties. You know, so health authorities, and these were not, you know, just African health experts. This was an international response to Ebola, and the World Health Organization played a very important role in that. And these were experts from all over the place, from all over the place in Africa, but also from all over the place in the whole world, right? And what they did was really to work with communities, with families, you know, telling them, discussing them with them, what was important for them, and how they could continue to live their lives while observing everything that needed to be observed to deal with the dangers of Ebola. And this worked out very well. You know, the people placed a lot of emphasis, for example, on how to carry out funeral rites, ceremonies, how to clean up people deceased of Ebola, you know, observing hygiene measures and so on. And that worked very well. That worked very well. Now, what I want to say with that, Eddie, is partly a response to your second question. And that is that the major constraining factor in Africa in addressing COVID, right, is the inability of African governments to create conditions for the kinds of measures that are going to be put in place to be put in place. You know, if you say the only possible response to this pandemic is a lockdown, then you need to be able to create conditions to ensure that people can actually do that. If people cannot do that, then you are being irresponsible. And worst of all, you are not giving them any life to protect. And this is what happened in a lot of countries, right? You know, you cannot tell someone not to go out and earn his or her living, right? Because he or she will be infected, right? But if that person stays at home, is going to die of hunger. You know, you need to give someone a reason to wish to protect his or her life. So this is the thing that African governments, not all of them, I think South Africa is quite an exception in this. I think Rwanda also, they seem to have the means to help people deploy those measures, right? And so if you can't do that, if you cannot do that, then you need to adopt a different kind of strategy. And that kind of strategy is going to be a cruel one, but that cruelty simply is a reflection of Africa's condition in the world. I wish we could, we could do things in a better way, in a more humane way, but we don't have the means. We don't have the ability to do that. And so, if we are not getting assistance from outside to do that, then we have to apply the hard measures that are necessary. And those hard measures cannot consist in locking people down. They will have to be about protecting people outside while they're earning their lives, they're living. You see, so in terms of policy advice, this is what I would actually say, that if donors want to assist Africa, then they have to strengthen the ability of governments to create conditions for these kinds of measures to be put in place, because this is what they cannot do, because they don't have that ability. And perhaps also in terms of looking into the future, I think these countries should be helped to have proper health infrastructure. And this does not mean having hospitals and clinics and so on, but really having a public health system, something that development aid has really neglected. So, okay.
Maybe if I could, you said something very interesting, which is that donors should strengthen the African states or African governments to kind of create the right environment for these measures. But then there's something I see personally with myself and with the environment I come from. So I'm Kenyan. There's a very big distrust of government. So even when we see that, say for example, that the World Bank has donated millions to help in the COVID-19, measures, we do not necessarily see these measures being put into place. So there's like a sort of disconnect that yes, the state should provide, but there is a mistrust that the state will provide, So I don't know I don't know what your thoughts are on this, for instance.
That's a great question, and it's a difficult one because it is speaking to two different kinds of issues. One issue is the issue of accountability, which is clearly a major challenge in Africa, right? That more often than not, our governments are not accountable. So there is a structural weakness in our democracies, in our polities, and those structural weaknesses will not go away simply because the World Bank donated money, right? And so this is a challenge not for the World Bank, but for Kenyan society, for African society. There's something that we need to do, to improve accountability so that people can place more trust on government, So that's one thing. The other thing is that we do have a very concrete problem that we are facing now, and that problem consists, for me, in the idea that the most effective measures that could be deployed cannot be deployed because African governments do not have the means to create the conditions, right? So this is a separate but related problem. And for that problem, we need a solution. One solution, I'm not in favor of it, but I can just express it here, would be to say, why not integrate the requirement that the money which the World Bank gives to an African government in support of these measures, that money is managed by a board which includes civil society organizations, for example. Why not do it in that way? I mean, I'm not in favor of it for all sorts of reasons, but I'm just saying that, that's a practical problem which can be addressed, right? The other one is also a practical problem, but that's a long-term problem, the problem of accountability. And so we need to keep them separate, perhaps.
May I ask something? Yes. Thank you for being here. It was very informative learning about what you had to say. I was just wondering, you mentioned the Ebola crisis, and what I can remember to some extent is that a lot of international actors were heavily involved in managing it, and they had their way of having to deal with the crisis themselves, and often it was not as beneficial towards the local people themselves, and therefore the locals found the necessary means to go about with the disease. For example, I believe it was hanging out their clothes rather than burning all their clothes, which is what a lot of international actors, for example, advised them to do. So I was just wondering, how do you envision this, the disease that's happening right now with COVID-19 taking form, and what can be done without having the involvement of international actors playing such a heavy role? Or do you think it needs to be done by the locals themselves rather than having international actors playing such a heavy role?
Okay, thank you, Rose. That's a great question. There again, I see two kinds of issues. One issue is a broader one and has to do with the knowledge that we have. How much knowledge do we have to deal with COVID-19? And I think it's safe to say that we don't know much, right? We really don't. Not in the same way that we knew a lot about Ebola. Knowledge of Ebola was much more. And therefore, it was a lot easier in the context of Ebola to really come up with practical solutions, which could be discussed in a rational way. This is not the case with COVID. If you remember, everything that you've read over the past 4 or 6 months, you will certainly know how often things changed and how often people contradicted one another. And these are experts, right? Such that actually, for me, as someone who works on risk and disasters, the most interesting aspect of this COVID-19 pandemic is to see how governments deal with scientific knowledge, right? So, we have this idea and ideal that scientific knowledge informs policy. But what we have had over the past 6 months is actually it's like a kind of reversing that, you know. So governments decide something, and then they shop around for the kind of science that will lend legitimacy to the decision that they have taken. That basically, that's what has been happening, right? So it's really a very, very delicate manner, such that I don't think that in this case the distinction between foreign experts and local experts, or foreign knowledge and local knowledge, is a useful one, because we are all struggling to find our bearings in this situation. Now, what you have had, a very interesting things, you know, like, you know, we had these people in several African countries, starting with Madagascar, coming up with some tonics and claiming that they could prevent and cure COVID, right? You know, similar things happened in Senegal, in Gabon, you know, in a lot of countries, right? And the challenge there was really to engage public sphere in a debate about what is reasonable to do, right? So it's not about science, it's about being reasonable, you know, that if you are not sure about something, don't make promises, and so on. Now, with Ebola, I don't know if you had already arrived, but what I said about Ebola was that there was, you know, a lot of dialogue, a lot of communication between foreign experts and local communities. And that was decisive because people were able to devise policies that did not go against, in their deployment, did not go against you know, what people thought was proper to do, right? I mean, look at what's happening now in a lot of countries in Africa. Funerals have been severely curtailed. So in Mozambique, in my own country, only 20 people are expected to attend a funeral. This is horrible. You know, it's really horrible. I know the thinking behind it, but you know, to simply say, look, you know, I mean, this is something that comes so naturally here in Europe because you know you don't have the habit of having such great funerals, right? You know, I've been to funerals here in Switzerland and in Germany, and there aren't many people there, right? So if you say 20 people, you know, maybe people are glad because then they will not be embarrassed by not having more people there. They can always say, well, it's because it was, you know, there's a limitation, yeah. But in Africa, this is just, you know, this is completely different, and I think that one needs to be sensitive to that, and one needs really to meet people along the way and say, look, you know, we're not going to say 20 people only. We're going to say as many people as they want to come to the funeral, but then, you know, make sure that you do this and this and this and that. You know, talk to people like they are adults, you know, and you know, if you do that, I think you are going to have the people on your side. If you don't do that, then the danger is that people will look at the measures not as necessary for something, but as an attack on them and on their culture, right? And so I really do think that the way that people addressed Ebola was effective because people paid a lot of attention to local everyday life.
And something you mentioned while answering that question is like talk to them like they're adults. And I think there's a history of, I think they call it infantilization when coming to the African society, which is like, we know what's best for you, listen. But then my question would maybe take a different direction, and what I would like to ask is about like, so you've talked about like the sociology of disaster, yeah? But then like I'm curious, for example, so for example in Kenya we have COVID-19, we had floods, we had locust invasion, and all of these things are turning points, so to speak. So does the sociology of disaster have anything to say about societies which are facing multiple disasters at the same time? Because I feel like more often than not, that's like African societies, you know, you're dealing with this and you're dealing with that. And I just wanted to know whether this is something that has been addressed.
Well, yes, that's something that's been addressed, but it has been addressed in a slightly different manner. So I think the first thing that's important here is to check whether a society or a community or an individual is in a position to risk, you know, so to translate a hazard into a risk. And this is a very difficult theoretical issue. And it has to do actually with the definition of a disaster. What is a disaster? And you don't want to know how difficult it has been to actually define disaster. So some people have come up with the idea that a disaster is when you know, there is a total collapse of a society. But you see, if there's total collapse of a society, or if there's a total collapse of coping mechanisms, then a society ceases to exist. And so you don't need sociology to study that, right? You just say, okay, so that's over, I have no more object there. But if you want to make the concept of disaster useful for research and for sociology, then you need to define it in a slightly different manner. And so some people have suggested, and that's an idea I go along with, that perhaps we want to understand disaster as the kind of strain which is placed on coping mechanisms. So that's a disaster. So when your coping mechanisms are strained, right? And so in that respect, there is actually no difference whether you have one disaster or multiple disasters happening at the same time, because the most important thing is the one that has to do with the strength of your and the resilience of your coping mechanisms. And so and then again, you know, we come back to an initial issue here, which is that if something happens that makes it completely impossible for you to do anything, then you are really in big trouble. Then you cannot respond to that thing in, you know, in familiar ways. You have to find a different way of responding to that. But that is something, Judith, that requires a lot of research, you know, to know exactly how people address such situations. I did research on disasters in my own country, and my interest in disasters actually started then. in the year 2000, there was a major flood in my country. It was actually in the news all over the world. And the whole international relief apparatus descended on Mozambique to help. Even Germany, the German army sent helicopters to rescue people who were drowning and so on. And that was, so I did research on that. And what was interesting about that? What was interesting about that was that when I started doing my research and talking to people and so on, then I realized that I was talking to people who were saying to me that they had been rescued several times, which I found strange. And I explored that, and then I found that really what happened was that people would be rescued by German or South African helicopters, right? And then at night, they swam back to their homes to pick up more things. And then early in the morning, they would be waving to the helicopters to come and pick them up with their goat, with something, right? What was happening there? What was happening was that the understanding of what a disaster is was completely different. So a disaster for the international relief apparatus, is when water is there and people are trapped and so on, right? So when lives are lost. Whereas people in that region, they were saying to me, this is just a normal event. Floods come, they are like a guest. They come, they stay for 2 or 3 days, and then they go, and we have a good harvest. Now, people will die, but that's the way things are, right? So you have a level of tolerance that is completely different. And I'm not saying that's fine. I'm just saying, you have your understanding of what a disaster is, and people have their understanding of what a disaster is. And if you want to foist your understanding of what a disaster is on other people, you may fail to understand the choices that they are making and the decisions that they are taking. So with colleagues in Germany, we also did a study, conducted a comparative study of how people respond to natural disasters in Mozambique, in Germany, and in the US. And that was also amazing. So we looked at floods. There had been floods in the Tennessee Valley. There had been floods in Frankfurt Oder, close to the border with Poland in Germany. Terrible floods. And of course, the floods in Mozambique, right? And it was amazing to find that attitudes to floods were similar between Mozambique and the US than they were between the US and Germany. And what made a difference was, what people expected from the state. So in Germany, the level of intolerance towards the loss of human life was much higher than it was in the US or in Mozambique. And so people tended to value, to evaluate that experience in a completely different way. So very similar between Mozambique and the US, and quite unique in the case of Germany. So it was amazing, for example, to find that people we interviewed in Germany, when no single life had been lost, were complaining so much about how terrible that the floods had been. And people who had lost lives in Mozambique, they were saying, oh, okay, this was a mild thing. right? So these are things that one needs to take into account. But the central issue, to come back to your question, the central issue has to do with coping mechanisms, right? And it doesn't really matter whether you have one or multiple disasters. What matters is really the kind of strain that is put on your coping mechanisms. Yes.
Yeah. Can I ask something? I'm also looking at Alisa and Judith. Okay, yeah, thanks. That's very interesting. And what you were saying about donor countries offering help with their own perspective and maybe not listening also to some of the needs. It's also what's now reflected in some of the debates in the Netherlands, that some, for example, NGOs, they're going on their own practice, offering help without really listening to what is actually needed. But my question, I wanted to actually to go back what you said earlier about coping mechanisms in West Africa around Ebola time in comparison, what is happening now. And if I just wanted to check if I understood you correctly, was what I understood that you also said, yeah, there were not such strong health systems, but people had their own arrangement and within the communities. And that was also one of the reasons why maybe there were less victims than you would think of. And at the same time, I also, if I listen to you correctly, you said like donor countries, what is neglected is the health infrastructure. So that's also one area where some African countries might need support. So is that not somehow also in contradiction, or did I not understood you correctly? I just wanted to verify. You should unmute, Elisio.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. Yeah, so I think again it's two things there. One thing is that I mean it's important to meet people halfway, right? So if you want to respond to something that is affecting people, you always want to make sure that those people can translate whatever has to be done in their own terms, right? So that they can feel comfortable with what they're doing. If you don't do that, then what you risk is creating anxiety in people, and then people will be suspicious of things that go wrong, right? And then it's easy for people then to actually blame those who want to help for the things that are happening and require help. Yeah, so that is why I think that the response to Ebola was really good because it came with knowledge which could be translated into local practices, and that happened. Now the other issue, this one is really very complex, Edith, and it is very complex for the simple reason that we tend to think that technology or science is the answer. And yes, technology and science is the answer. But it is a problem before it is an answer. You see? And so what Paul Richards was claiming about the lacking health infrastructure in West Africa was that if they had taken people to treat them in hospitals, because of all the problems that health facilities have in Africa, the rates of infection would have exploded. You know, and I mean, this is not something that's particular to Africa, but because of the conditions, the consequences are worse in Africa. You know, so you know that even here in Europe, hospitals are not safe, right? And so you know of all the people who get sick because they went to hospital, right? Now imagine how much worse that is in a context where you do not have the means to really provide safe services in hospitals. So that's the point that he was making, that if you take people to a hospital with this very, very dangerous disease, and you don't have ways of making sure that everything is observed, you're going to have a lot of trouble, right? So that's the thing. In that respect, it's not really a contradiction. It's really a word of caution. You know, it's saying, look, pay attention to everything which needs to be met before a solution can work, right? And so before health infrastructure can be a solution, a lot of things have to be put in place. And that's often the problem in our context. And that's, you know, generally speaking, also the problem with development policy. Because development policy always works on the assumption that its solutions are solutions. No, its solutions are problems in the first place. And for them to work, again, it's the same process. They have to be translated by the people, you know, so they are a hazard, and then people translate them into a risk, you know, for themselves, and then they might work. So that's the thing, and that is what is perhaps wrong also, or problematic with help from abroad, because help from abroad always makes the assumption that you know, that thing that you have identified as the solution, you know, will work as a solution without any kind of tampering, you know. So it's almost like you know, one size fits all kind of thing. Things don't work that way, you know. And this is what I also always advise people who's in my country, you know. I say, don't look at what development policy is telling you as solutions. Look at those things as problems, you know, and try to translate them into solutions for yourselves. That's how these things work. So it's actually, I'm probably repeating myself here, because it's the same logic that I was trying to use in the lecture to say, look, there's always a process of translation here. You are translating a hazard into a risk. So we need to pay attention to that process, not to the outcome, but to the process. And that process is bound to be different depending on the setting and on the context.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I think you touched on, by answering Edith, you touched on in your presentation, you mentioned something about the idea that risk is, you mentioned the idea that some scholars say that risk can only be made sense of in technologically advanced countries and not in poor countries. I think you kind of answer to that using Edith in response to Edith. And I just don't know, maybe I'm asking you to repeat again, but but what would you say, what would your response to this be, for example, that, you know, what would your response be to this kind of idea that risk is something that only like advanced countries can afford and not something that poor countries can take it?
Okay, thank you. So I think there are two separate issues there. So there's actually in the sociology of risk, there's a discussion. It was much stronger in the 90s. It's less so now. So with the likes of Ulrich Beck, Anthony Giddens, Scott Lash. So, you know, in the 90s, there was a very interesting debate going on about the sociology of risk and whether, you know, certain societies can be included as part of the concerns of that particular sociology. But because of the way that people defined risk, they actually excluded a lot of societies because they made risk dependent on scientific knowledge and on technology, because they were very concerned with, especially with nuclear war, you know, nuclear technology and so on. And of course, you don't have nuclear technology in Mozambique or in Kenya. And so, you know, people thought that because of that, you know, there are technological risks, and therefore the sociology of risk studies this. And therefore, actually, these societies don't even know what risk is, because you know, to know what risk is, you need knowledge, scientific knowledge, and then on the basis of that, you decide to do something that might be dangerous, right? So you know that nuclear technology, if things go wrong, it can be a huge problem, and still you say, look, I'm going to do it. You know, you are aware of the danger. Now, and so people would take that to actually mean that risk is a quintessentially Western notion. You don't find that notion in any other society. And so what I did in my own work was actually to argue against that. So my habilitation thesis in Germany was really about engaging this discussion and trying to show that risk is an anthropological constant. That is, it is present in every human society. You know, so even those farmers, peasants in Mozambique who seem helpless in the face of a flood, they're taking risks all the time. You know, when they decide to settle on the banks of a river that may flood, they're taking a risk. So instead of saying, look, they don't know the dangers that they are facing, what you should do is try and find out what they are doing to limit the losses, because that's what risk is all about. You know, so what are they doing to limit their losses, right? It's very interesting because when I was still very active in the field of disaster and risks and doing work on that, I also engaged with the German Technical Cooperation Agency. At the time, it was called GTZ, and it was helping Mozambique to set up early warning systems, you know, to face natural disasters, particularly floods. And they spent a lot of money, a lot of energy helping Mozambique to do that. And it was amazing, you know, and I was involved in discussions with them. They invited me to comment on their work. You know, so they showed films of communities that had been taught, you know, to recognize the signs of floods coming. And then, you know, people would whistle and then people would move, and then you know, if things get worse, they will move again, and so on, you know, and they were happy with themselves, except that this was complete bullshit, total bullshit, because, you know, it's almost like saying these people have no way of ascertaining, you know, things that can be dangerous to them. In my own research, I found out that people had very sophisticated ways of actually beginning to suspect that a flood might be on its way. You know, the presence of certain insects, the color of the water, these were all, you know, indications of something that's bad that's going to happen, you know, and people use that to prevent themselves. They don't need a German to come with a whistle to, you know, to tell them move away and so on. And the other thing that the Germans didn't realize was that because of relief aid, a very specific type of community emerged in Mozambique, you know, flood communities. You see, because when there's a disaster like that, then relief agencies come and then give people, you know, equipment for their house, chairs, you know, these plastic things, you know, cooking tools, or, you know, there's a set of stuff, and then food that people get. And so a lot, you know, some of these communities, how did they emerge? People know when floods are going to happen and where. So just before that happened, people went there and settled, right, temporarily. And then the floods come, and then they are victims. And the relief agencies come and give them all of these things, right? And the next flood that happens 200 kilometers away, they're there again, you know? Yeah, we need to be careful with this. The point here I'm making is that risk is an anthropological constant. You know, this distinction that people make between technologically advanced societies and, you know, may be useful for certain things, especially, you know, if you want to look at how people deal with something like a technological disaster, you know, then you know, that distinction might be useful. But that distinction cannot be used to claim that people have no sense of risk, or that certain societies have no sense of risk. That's silly, I would say.
Does anyone have another question? No? Okay, the last question, I promise, and then we can leave, because I think we're slightly over time. There's something, when you're talking about in the lecture, you talk about translating hazard to risk. And I think you give like a very good example of COVID-19, and in the translation you talk about keeping the death rate normal. And when I was reading it, I couldn't help but go back to this concept of a social calculus, and like about how, you know, who lives and who dies during a disaster is very much a calculation of, it's very much a calculus. But then when I remember the first time I encountered this quote, I thought it was very much a calculus on the part of the people implementing, so like the government and other relief agencies. But during your lecture, I can't help but also think that it's also a calculus on the people affected. Because, for example, if you tell me to stay home but I'm unable to sustain my livelihood, I will make the decision to go out and eat, because I'd rather die from the virus than die from hunger. So I don't know whether this is something you maybe agree with, or maybe there's something I need to tweak with my thinking.
Well, I mean, I think this applies, and maybe this is what makes the whole thing so interesting, it applies actually at many different levels. So it's not just one instance or one level doing the translation. It's several levels. So it's governments translating, it's communities translating, and it's individuals translating, right? I think that's a useful notion, social calculus, right? Because that's what it is all about. What you're saying is, okay, given what I know about a particular thing and what I don't know, what are the odds that if I do this, something bad is going to happen? And then the most important thing is to say, okay, if something bad happens, what should I do? So maybe that takes me back to Edith's first question, that that is a crucial question to address for development policy. You want to help people to have an answer to that question. What will happen if something bad happens on account of the decision that I took to act in a certain way, right? And then strengthen people there at that level, right? So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's the challenge, to try and bring that complexity into some kind of algorithm that can enable you to do something, at least to think about the challenge that people are facing. And that's something that I fear we are not doing in this COVID, right? So we are really copying and pasting our way into disaster. I mean, we have the problem now in Mozambique, but also in other countries. I mean, in Mozambique, we are into our 3rd month of a state of emergency, right? And now cases are picking up, right? But because the government has now realized that this is very, it's a heavy weight on people. Now that the cases are picking up, the government is saying, well, we need to come out of this lockdown. It's so contradictory. I know why they're doing this, and I'm so happy. I don't have to take these decisions because they're very hard decisions to take, right? But you see, if this is very simple. If when you had one case, you had lockdown. Now you have 900 cases. You are saying no lockdown. How are people going to take you seriously? Right? And of course, I understand that. I know it makes sense to relax on the measures, right? But it's very complicated, I would say. So thank you.
Alyssa, do you want maybe to close it up?
Yeah, sure. So thank you everyone who did end up coming today. It was very interesting. Thank you for your discussion, Elisio, and your lecture. It was very, very nice to hear from you. And thank you for all the questions that came today. And so this is our last session for our lecture series. So we're happy to close it off with you all here. Too bad we didn't have a higher turnout, but like we said before, the timing is not the most ideal. So yeah,